stay stitch lines. Just quick. And again, they're really just guidelines. You do want to be careful that they're not more than 1/4 of an inch, otherwise you're going to see them on your shirt, and you don't want to see that stitching. Then, like I said, I'm going to top stitch or stay stitch this this line for the continuous lap. And really, don't go beyond where it says, because it really only accounts for as big as this actual continuous lap piece. If anything, we'd like our continuous lap to be bigger than this, because we're actually going to cut into our fabric here. So we really don't want we don't want to run out of fabric there. Again, it's really just stay stitching. It's a guide. This is also meant to make it so that the fabric doesn't tear as you do this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut into this right up the center, but not past where that last stitch is. Very important. But right to it, right up to it. And I'm going to turn this into a flat piece. So making it as flat as possible, and you can see that image on that handout. And then I'm going to line this up and sew these together. And I like to do, let's see, this is the wrong side, so right side to wrong side, because you can have a little bit, then you have more control when you do your top stitching. So this starts at about 1/4 of an inch here if you cut that in the center, so you can line up those stay stitch lines a bit, and you really want to make sure that you try and get it as flat as possible. And I'm going to sew from the side that has the more fabric. Remember how I always tell you guys that we stitch from the side that has the fullness? Now this point is going to go down a little bit, so that's okay. You can let it move down inside that 1/4 of an inch space a little bit. Don't be too afraid to allow that to happen. You're going to want to stitch pretty carefully right just on that 1/4 of an inch line. You don't want to go on the seam allowance side of that, because you want to make sure that you don't see this stitching, but you can get really close to it. And as I approach this point where there's clearly a bunch of fabric, you can kind of move it around just carefully, and you can be close to that little point, but make sure that you do actually catch it. You don't want a hole at the top, right? And you don't want there to be too much of a pucker. You might get a little something in there, but try your best to get it as flat as possible. And then I'm going to press this towards, sorry about that, thank you. I'm going to press this just like I just did for my my placket and my collar. I'm going to press this extra towards the placket itself. I'm going to fold this over right on that stitch line. Again, you really want to make sure that it's not folded over so that you're going to see it. You're going to fold it over to hide it, and then we're going to fold it over again just like the Hong Kong seam, and we're going to stitch along that straight line. So let me just press this really quick. You'll find that the straightness will sort of easier once you press it too. Alright, so then I'm ready. I'm going to just top stitch it so you can see I folded it over and over. And again, as you sort of approach that turn, you should be able to avoid the puckers a little bit. It's challenging, but you can do it. And what's going to happen is you're going to fold one over the other. Once we do our pleats, you'll see which way to do it. So next I'm going to do my pleats. So again, I'm going to match this guy up to that guy. And if you get confused, look at your pattern. So not the one notch to another, and I'm going to just about an inch, give or take. I mean, if you don't want to see stitching, you can do less. You can do a ½ inch, and then that'll just get sewn into the get sewn into the cuff. And again, this one's gonna also go. So it's kind of like a dart, but you're not doing any tip, you're just doing, it's just a pleat. But we're sewing these pleats down rather than just pressing them, right? And the next thing I'm gonna do is just make sure that I actually sew these down with a stay stitch so that they're facing the correct way. And to check that, we can look at how our placket is going to close. So this is going to be the back right here. So this should go I always get confused about this. But that's why we have patterns, right? So our pleats went like that. Nope. And you can press these too. And so this should go there. And what you'll do is this will end up getting stay stitched down. So if you want, you can stay stitch this whole thing. Remember, stay stitch is just within that 1/2 inch. Just double check that. Oh, I did it wrong. Even with checking it, it's confusing. So the other way that I just checked it was looking. 2 notches means the back of your sleeve, so if you put it up to your body, you know that this is going to be the back. And so again, you want this to fold down. So I'm sorry, you can just stay stitch this one side. And again, these should also go down like that. Now, there are 2 ways to set in your sleeve. So that now we're ready to either close our seam line here, which is the underarm seam, or if we're going to set this into the shirt, there's 2 different ways to set a sleeve into the shirt. There is the way that you would do like a t-shirt. Normally you would set this in. A set-in sleeve means you're going to take a circle, 2 circles, like you're going to close the circuit by sewing your underarm seam, and you're going to also close the circuit by doing your side seam, and then you set that circle in, so set in sleeve, right? Mostly anything with like a slight cap is going to be a set in sleeve, but a little trick that, you know, if you're doing something with a knit or something, even these shirts are kind of okay to do this. You're going to just leave it open, and then you're going to do the whole seam from the top to the bottom. So you're going to actually put the sleeve in first and then do your side seam. So I'm going to show you that first. Let me just make sure my right side is this side. So I need to just match my notches up, so I actually have to go over to this side. So again, right sides together, and this can be very confusing. Just double, triple check before you sew anything. You can show it to me before you sew anything. And so we're going to match those notches up. Double notches, right sides together. Double notches are at the back, and then the single notch at the front. And again, your side seam should also match up with that underarm seam pretty easily, accurately. Oh, okay. So when you do the sleeve this way, I forgot one thing. So before you put your sleeve in, you got to do 2 rows of gathered stitches from one notch to the other, just like we did on the gathered samples. And this is going to create a slight cap for us to make it a little easier to get this curve to go into something that's straighter. So 1 row of stay stitching first, basting number 5, and then a second row right next to it, and all of this should happen within that seam allowance. So be careful not to go beyond that 1/2 inch. You don't want to have to see this. Okay? I'm giving you guys a lot of information with this, but it's kind of easier to just do it all at the same time rather than breaking it up. Alright, so then you're going to pull this just a little, just to give it a little bit. See what happens when I pull it? How it starts to curve over nicely, like the way it would hang on an arm, right? Or on the shoulder. Every sleeve, I mean, not not on knits, you wouldn't bother with this, but it pulls it just enough so that it's gonna hang nicely in that spot. So now again, I'm gonna just double check my notches, double notch here, double notch there. And you'll find now that when I go to actually put this in, it's going to be much smoother and easier to fit in. If you mark these little dots at the top there, those are also, those are matching up with the seams for the yoke and the actual shoulder seam itself. So see how much easier that's fitting in already? Just makes it just a little bit smaller, a little bit easier. And again, I'm going to sew from the side that has the fullness. So the sleeve side this time. 1/2 inch, 2.5. Don't forget to go back up after you're done your gathering stitches. Now this, both ways of setting in the sleeve have their like pluses and minuses. It's a matter maybe of preference, of material, of pattern. If the pattern has a lot of fullness in the sleeve, like things like a tailored jacket, you would not want to do a sleeve like this. You would definitely want to do a set-in sleeve because those patterns are going to have a lot more fullness in them to create a much bigger cap of the sleeve, rounding around the top of the shoulder. You'll start to learn this, but I think it's a good opportunity to practice both ways. I never learned this way when I was in school, and it took a long time for me to figure out that this is sometimes a little bit easier. So I'm imparting that knowledge to you guys. Definitely got some puckers in there, I think. So that'll be, remember I couldn't show you that before, but now I can show you. And you know, it's like I keep saying, it's no big deal if you get some puckers. Some you can scratch out. So this is a tiny little pucker. You can actually scratch that out. No big deal. Don't need to fix that. Yeah, I actually didn't get any big ones. So now I've done that. I can press that, and then I'm going to sew right sides together from the top to the bottom. And I'm going to make sure I match my underarm seams, or my sleeve seams rather, here. Very important that those match, and that the edges of the side seam and the underarm seam match down here. And it doesn't matter where you start, bottom or top, everything should match up perfectly. Just make sure you're actually doing your front to your back and not your front to your front or anything. It might be kind of impossible to do that, but still good to double check everything. If you're unsure about how you pin something, you can always check it you know, by pinning it a lot and then actually turning it right side out and making sure it actually looks like a shirt. You guys all know what shirts look like, so. And there are notches on the side seam and the underarm seam that you can double check. Make sure that dart is pushed downwards. Rest downwards. Okay, so that is your one sleeve. And what I'm going to show you is the cuff, and then I'll do the, I'm going to do the cuff on this final one, and then separately I'll show you a set-in sleeve. So, the cuff is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's kind of like the collars that we just did, or the placket in a way. Very Hong Kong seam again. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew this around 3 sides. Now one of these sides has a notch to it. You're going to want to leave that side open, okay? Right sides together, so you're going to see your interfacing. And again, this is, one of them will be interfaced, one of them will not be interfaced. It's 1/2 inch all the way around. Again, when we go around those curves, those corners, you're going to want to do our technique with the diagonal, because we want our corners to be nice and sharp on our cuffs, just like on our collar. Again, very important that you pay attention to the size of this because it's going to have to fit into that sleeve hole that you just made. And so if this is more than a 1/2 inch seam allowance or less than a 1/2 inch seam allowance, it's no longer going to really fit. Same thing with your corners. And you can grade these seams as well for practice. If you don't want to grade them, you still at least have to clip away. If you're nervous about clipping away, you can always have me check something before you cut. Problem is, like, once you cut, sometimes the clipping, you can't really, you have to either recut it or you have to be very careful if something went wrong. I'm going to turn that right side out, and we're going to then put that into our sleeve. Now just make sure when you sew this on that all of those things that you stay stitched down are going the correct way, and again, you might want to press them. There is a notch. There's a notch after the two pleats. That is going to be where that notch meets with the notch on the cuff. So you're going to start at the end of this placket. Just don't forget that this placket has to get turned under. So where that starts is going to be turned under. It should match up with that notch. Maybe a little off, but again, it's not the end of the world. And I'm doing wrong side to right side here so that when I top stitch, again, it's on the actual top of the fabric so that I can control what it's going to look like. And I go all the way over to where that placket ends, and anything in between should fit perfectly. Your side seam can be pressed open. If you can get in there, it gets a little hard to get in there, but I'm not pressing, but you should be pressing all the seams open that you make. This shoulder seam is a little tough to press open, and that's sort of, sometimes I can see like Stevens's top stitch. You can also add decorative top stitching to that. Sometimes it can be a little fussy though, so be careful. Again, I'm going to start where that placket ends, just like I did on my collar. 1/2 inch seam allowance. Making sure all of those pleats and everything are going the correct way. And then I'm going to end that right where that seam is, not past like I just did. Okay. And again, just like the collar, just like the Hong Kong seam, all of the things that we've been doing in the placket, we're going to press that away and make sure it's nice and smooth in here. Again, we don't want this to be folding over like this because it's going to mess up our how neat everything is. So I'm going to press this over just like I have been, and it's going to go just beyond those lines, those stitching lines. And I'm going to press this so you guys can see. With the collar, you can pin this if you want, but you're going to stitch from the right side. I turned it inside out to press it because it's a little bit easier to do that, but it's actually easier to stitch it from the right side. It's difficult. This pressing gets a little tough because we're kind of in some tight areas, but you're going to just top stitch on that edge, again, that 1/8 of an inch edge, and because it's a small circular area, you're going to have to kind of adjust. So you stop after doing a little bit of stitching, readjust, and then, like I said, you can also top stitch around this, around your cuff for some neatness and drama. Okay, now you have a cuff, and you can see, like I said, you press this placket once you've finished, and so that's where your buttons actually overlap, right? So you'll have two little buttons right there, or one. I think the pattern only has one, but you can put two. So you press that little continuous lap, and it's nice and smooth. So that's your cuff. You want to stop.